So welcome everyone. Here we are at the kickoff day of the Milken Institute Global Conference, really focusing on the theme of driving shared prosperity as we see. But in this particular panel, I think it's about really the core aspect of what does that mean to create a prosperous society, to really, in many ways, give back to humanity and, kind of also enjoy. With art and culture, we're able to do so much of that. So our panel is focused on the idea of representation and representation in American art and inclusion and social change. And I think so much of what we're trying to discuss here is, with our panelists, we, have each category, as one would say, within arts and culture. We have at the core, the artist, Charles Gaines, who is really the person, and, as the artist is the reason, we can even celebrate such a thing and celebrate society in general. And we have Bluhm, who here represents the collector, the patron, and the person who really supports institutions and supports the museums and ultimately the artists that then show in those museums. We have Joanne Heiler, the executive director of the Broad, who also, in many ways is the person who discusses and deals with at the core, artists and showing those artists in an institutional setting, but is able to be that conduit between the private patron and the artist and society and the public. The Broad has been a kind of historic venue with free admission to the public, and in Los Angeles has been an incredibly important part of that. And then Kristen Sakota, who in some ways creates the infrastructure for it all, the executive director of the LA County Arts Commission. I think actually to begin, perhaps because, in the context of what we're doing here at the Milken Institute, let's talk about maybe the infrastructure of that first. So let's start with Kristen to just tell us, what does a county arts commission do? Because actually it's a question I got asked many times about you and your role, and then we can kind of segue into that. And then I also want to encourage from the audience, if there's something you want to ask or discuss, I really encourage you to please raise your hand, and we want to make this a conversation for us all and talk about that. We'll be having the slides play in the background kind of related to each one of our panelists' interests, work, and that aspect of what they'll be discussing, but we won't be referring specifically to them.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here and appreciate the opportunity to speak to this work and on this excellent panel of colleagues. So yes, I'm Kristen Sakota, Executive Director of the LA County Arts Commission, and you really did hit it on the head, as they say, about our role supporting cultural infrastructure. So we are what we would say in our parlance, a local arts agency. I am part of the government, and in fact, I always say our role sits at the intersection of the arts, philanthropy, and government. For us, we represent the county, and so we're supporting arts and culture on behalf of the county, and that's the jurisdiction in which we sit. That is 10 million people. That's the largest county in the United States. It's also one of the most diverse places, rich with arts, culture, entertainment, and cultural heritage. Now, how do we support arts and culture, you might add? Well, we do that in a number of ways. Core to that, typical of a local arts agency, is grant funding. So we award grants to nonprofit arts institutions, as well as recently we've expanded that work to include social service and social justice organizations that have a program that supports their work through the arts. So we're supporting hundreds of organizations all across the county, from the smallest that you might think of to a culturally specific like East West Players, the longest running theater of color in the country, to MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art. And so that's one of the ways. We also advance arts education education writ large, again, looking broadly at the whole county. There are 81 school districts. We're really trying to have all those 1.5 million students have access to the arts as part of arts education. We commission artists for civic art projects. We do some research and evaluation, and we have some other initiatives around cultural equity and inclusion. So I'll be excited to talk more about that as part of the conversation, but very much what we look at, our role is investing in the arts and ensuring that there is ample infrastructure to support artists, organizations, and cultural participation for the entire county.
So speaking of supporting artists, I mean, Charles, you of course are a practicing artist, but you're also a professor and a writer, an academic. How do you see the work that you have done and the way in which you have evolved very much as a part of Los Angeles? I mean, I know you're originally from South Carolina, but very much a part of the kind of core artistic community here in Los Angeles. How does this evolution of what's happening here, the work of somebody like Kristen, the work of Joanne, and then helping you advance in your career and being able to show your work? I believe your first major show was actually at the Whitney Biennial in 1975.
That's right. Thank you.
I can assure you I wasn't around.
So how have you seen just the ways in which you've worked here in Los Angeles kind of evolve, and actually having a support system and having people appreciate and really include work in a very different way?
Well, thanks for the invite, first of all. Yeah. And it's a somewhat complicated question because there is a major part of the practice of art that's kind of solitary, and so there's that running a studio or maintaining a studio and making work, and that's pretty much labor, and you're involved with you're involved behind those closed doors. And but the question, there is nevertheless an important aspect having to do with what happens beyond the studio. In the most immediate sense, it's the relationship with the LA art community, or even the global art community in terms of having exhibitions, and so. I mean, in that respect, we're sort of we're subject to the conditions of the global situation. I'm not just talking about the art market, but I'm simply talking about what the landscape looks like in terms of what's available for artists to exhibit. Mm-hmm. But there was another part, and that is that, and I think it's much more direct in terms of the community relations, that artists. Direct relationships with these institutions. Not the relationship with a gallery, of course, is a commercial one, but with museums and nonprofit spaces and so forth, there's a real outreach to try, as an artist, to help support and buttress the general art community. And so, in this respect, in my case, I'm on the Santa Monica. We used to be the Santa Monica Museum, but now it's the ICA LA. I'm on the board there, and I'm also
on the involved with Boyle Heights. I think we were discussing that.
Yeah, it wasn't directly related to being in the museum, and I'll get to the Boyle Heights thing for sure. But I just wanted to say that there's these things that artists do in terms of supporting the community in a way that other communities members support the community, and serving on boards and artists. Councils. I'm on the Hammer Museum Artists Council, and Santa Monica Museum Artists Council.
So being a part of the kind of infrastructure of power also.
Yeah, and then also these spaces ask us to donate work a lot.
Donating to galas every year.
Yeah, and so you have to be careful with that, of course, but there's that kind of support. So about that, and then it's, of course, in my case, that I also teach. Mm-hmm. And I regard my involvement in teaching as a form of community support.
Mm-hmm, of course. And Neil, I mean, I know, of course you have a celebrated collection, but in many ways what we want to talk about with you is, your involvement with institutions and why that's important. And I think you were just mentioning to me as we were walking here, the opening of the Whitney Museum of American Art. And that's such a big part of its title, and showing work such as Charles's work and how that reflects the whole of America, and also your community in Chicago and the work that you've done there. So perhaps tell us a little bit about your involvement with the opening of the new Whitney.
Well, I'm not exactly sure why I'm here, but I'm a collector. I'm a trustee of both the Whitney and the Art Institute, and support those institutions. But the underlying importance, I think, and one of the reasons why I'm interested in art, is because artists tend to express themselves in many ways which are really leading change in our country, in our community, for the better in most cases. And so I think that's very important because they're able to express themselves in a variety of different ways. So the perfect example of a successful expression was when we arrived here yesterday. First thing we did when we got off the plane was go to the Broad, and I saw this fantastic exhibition of the Soul of America, which for any of you who haven't done it, I strongly recommend you do it. Because it basically is, and you'll tell this a lot better, but that's your baby. I'm an independent person.
I like hearing the independent view.
It was very moving. It tells the story of what artists were doing starting in 1963, dealing with the change in America, dealing with racial injustice. And not only was the art great, but I was very moved, as was my girlfriend Kimberly, when we saw so many young parents with their children of every walk of life, basically going through the history of the civil rights movement and discussing it with little kids who, of course, never lived through that. They were, 5 or 10 years old, and that was very moving. So art in that context can be very, very helpful. It doesn't always work, because I want to tell you the story about the Whitney. When we opened our museum, there was a debate whether, should we show our best, Rothkos or our most valuable, most famous paintings, or the group, Adam Weinberg decided in this group, no, we should do a history of American art. So at the opening of the museum, Michelle Obama came to the opening, and we gave her a tour. And while we walked through, there were a bunch of paintings of lynchings. I had never knew anything about this. These were obviously not famous, valuable things. And I asked, why do we have all these paintings of lynchings? And it turned out, starting in 1918, there was a federal movement to make lynchings a federal crime. But the southern states objected to it, I assume in part because they were afraid the FBI would come in and investigate rather than the local authorities. Believe it or not, they stopped every one of the efforts to pass that law. And to this date, no law has yet been passed that made lynchings a federal crime, to my knowledge. So this was an example of protest, if you will, but it wasn't as successful as the Broad.
So an example of artist as a form of commemoration, an artist as a form of almost, news, and really
Right.
documentation.
And Michelle was so moved that she kept coming back with her children. They were younger, obviously, at the time, to show them, and she brought the president also. He wasn't with her that day. It was a very moving thing to see people painting lynchings because they were protesting lynchings.
And Joanne, I think that's like a really kind of wonderful way for us to hear, well, wonderful in the sense of bittersweet, as to why we even have to look at this in the lens of right now seeing art and artists dealing with such subjects and not having seen this ever before in many ways at institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing I can speak to is the journey of bringing Soul of a Nation, that exhibition, to Los Angeles. I have to give credit to colleagues at the Tate Modern who are the originators
As
of
a
that
proud
exhibition.
Londoner, I will say yes. Thank you,
It's interesting
Tate.
in and of itself, right, that a British institution put this together. Co-curators, an American-born curator and a British-born curator, put the show together. And I actually first saw the show when it was close to the end of its run at the Tate Modern at the end of 2017.
And it broke attendance records at the Tate. So if you can imagine a show about African American protest art in the 1960s and 70s has like nothing to do with a British context at all, but bringing in audiences, very local audiences in London.
Right. Yeah, it was very, very, well received in London. Was very meaningful for the audience there, and I was lucky enough to have a tour of the show from one of the co-curators. And at the end, I asked him. I said, "Well, is this show traveling?" And he said, "Yes, it's going to go to Crystal Bridges in Arkansas, and it's going to go to the Brooklyn Museum in New York." And I said, "That's great," and paused for a second, thought about our calendar. could I think about it coming to the Broad? And obviously, we ultimately found a way to make that happen. And it was a journey. The decision itself was a bit of a journey that I think is relevant to your question, because so as a private collection, as a very public museum, but about a private collection, a collection that started as a private collection, we spend most of our calendar showing works from the collection, but we do 1 or 2 loan exhibitions per year on the first floor of the museum. And we had this informal policy that from the very beginning, from before we opened, well, we'll do loan exhibitions, borrowing from other collections, when it's relevant, or when it's featuring artists in the collection. Okay, simple enough. It was a way to kind of put some boundaries around what we could do any number of things, but we really wanted to focus on the collection as it was. And so Soul of a Nation actually didn't fill that requirement. Soul of a Nation was actually filled with artists who were actually not in the Broad collection, and so I had to really stop and think about. I was so moved by the show. It had such Los Angeles as a place of art practice for African American artists in the civil rights era and through to 1983, which is the last year of the period covered by the show. I had to really think about that sort of perhaps dissonance, and sort of reframe how I thought about the programming for the museum. And what I started to think about, instead of focusing on that sort of not arbitrary, but that policy decision we had made, was to think about the era. So I have had a number of colleagues very flatteringly say to Eli or to myself that our museum is about late 20th century American art, and yet none of the artists in Soul of a Nation are in our collection. So, how do you honor what this museum is, and yet bring some real richness to your audience? And Soul of a Nation was such a beautifully put together show. It was, I think, a lot of shows that are sort of covering a historical period and are inclusive of so many artists. There are over 60 artists in the show. Can be very superficial. Can be a little, they can go awry quickly, and this one wasn't because it followed the lead of the artists and their collaborative groups and their struggles to get recognition from the art world. It was such a compelling show. It was so much about Los Angeles, and ultimately it's 100% an overlap with the period covered in our museum, so to speak. So, you know, the collection of the Broad collection really gains force in terms of history in the 1960s with works by Warhol and Jasper Johns, et cetera.
And so to be able to see that show also on the ground floor, but then to also have the collection
So to
still
see
at
that
the same
show
time.
on the ground floor and see Faith Ringgold's flag, or see Benny Andrews' flag, or see the many David Hammond's works that feature the American flag, and then go upstairs and see the Jasper Johns flag, or to see the works of Noah Purifoy or John Riddle or others in the LA Assemblage Gallery that's part of the show. And I know you're not seeing very many images of the show for those of you who haven't seen it, or this may be a little bit abstract, but and then see maybe Robert Rauschenberg upstairs. The resonance of that to me was undeniable and important, and so for that reason, for our young audience, which Neil, your comments make a lot of sense in terms of the sort of intergenerational response to the show. Our museum audience, it has an average age of 33, which is for a museum, an art museum, very young compared to many other institutions nationally. For all those reasons, ultimately decided to bring the show here.
And so the idea of not just, you know, this show, of course, but what you're trying to do at the Broad, you know, as we just kind of alluded to in terms of, you know, your involvement in, you know, Boyle Heights, and Neil, we were talking a little bit about the Whitney, and how does your decision to bring something like Soul of a Nation, but then also just the decision of building the museum and building the Broad, you know, working with the city to do that, you know, how do you...
Predated Kristen. She didn't have to go
Yeah.
through any of the the building portion.
Well done. How do you think about the position of a museum? And again, you know, we have an esteemed guest in the audience, Klaus Biesenbach, director of MoCA, also on Grand Avenue. You know, this idea of museums as a part of the fabric of the city. So being a teacher, being a professor at, you know, one of the most esteemed art schools in the world, you know, and if not the country and the city, and very much a reason of why, you know, they say, you know, LA has this renaissance within the arts. You know, I think this is a question for all of you. How do you see the position of an institution and what your mission is to bring in that aspect of community?
Well, when we were planning, is that a question for me? Before
We'll start with you.
Okay.
Because we just finished, so
you know, Eli had a one-word definition of success when people would ask, what will success look like as we were planning this museum? And there were detractors and promoters of the museum. It was sort of a topic of conversation as it was in the works, roughly 2011 until it opened in 2015. And his one-word answer was attendance. I assumed he meant lots of attendance. You know, from that simple answer came my spin on what that means, which is welcome. You know, you have to be very welcoming. I find it imperative to be very, very welcoming, and everything about designing the museum, even the building itself, was geared in that direction. But also we have a program where the sort of gallery attendants, the guards, if you will, in the museum are all trained really quite extensively. They get 50 hours of training before they sort of hit the floor, as it were, and are trained in just, I won't go through everything, but not just the history of the collection and the art on view, but also to read, how do you read body language from a visitor? How do you differentiate between someone who's maybe open and ready to talk to you about the art versus someone who's there to maybe just spend time contemplating quietly?
Some of my favorite interactions visiting a museum space in general in the world has been when a guard is really engaged with the show and engaged with, you know, kind of being a part of that. And I think you see that, you know, in many ways, like, where they're just so excited by the fact that you're there and that they are a part of it and they're living in this room for, you know, hours in a day. And I mean, I think with the work you're doing in terms of, you know, kind of opening up the idea of inclusion and training, like the internship program, perhaps we can talk a little bit about how you train people to be a part of a cultural community.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the threads that you kind of started on for this line was around sort of the role of art and culture and institutions, right, as part of the fabric of society. And I think what we're seeing in so many different ways is different ways that you can be engaged in supporting that. I absolutely believe, and really the theory of change in a lot of ways behind a lot of our work is that cultural organizations are essentially providers of opportunities and access to arts and culture, whether that be through an educational lens or presentational lens, exhibits, performances, and what have you, and overlaying public policy on that, as we do a lot in my role, is where I really begin to look at not only that art is intrinsically value to us as human beings. I mean, this is the essence of who we are, but that the government or others really do have a role in supporting it, regardless of what they might say at the federal level, if a budget speaks, because art is critical for society, but we also see so many other benefits. Right? We see that when folks are more engaged in the arts, we see higher civic engagement. We see that when there's arts and culture in community, so community-based organizations, in addition to our sort of larger downtown core, right? That's when we actually see statistically correlated better outcomes in well-being, ranging from educational attainment, better health rates, even increased public safety, right? So lower crime rates. So once you know all of that and you're thinking about not only the intense role really that artists can have in shifting that story of the lynchings, in shifting us, in provoking us, in reflecting to us, but also from a public policy lens, if art and culture is a public good, I can't unknow that. I've now really got to think about equity and inclusion. That's part of our organizational effectiveness. So that's really present on our mind, whether we're investing, and then I can do my little cheerleading, whether we're investing $1 million this year in the largest paid college arts internship program in the country, which we are, yes, so that we can continue to have a whole range of, diverse leaders and folks having access to opportunities or whatever we might be doing. But that's really, I think, the through line for me.
Charles, you were saying your own community, involvement has been, really teaching and being a part of a student and community experience. How do you find, have the students shifted? Have their questions shifted? You've been doing this throughout a very, let's say, evolving period in Los Angeles. And it must have been very different to see, students at the beginning of what you've been doing and students now, and then also the way in which they probably engage with your work.
I can connect the question about teaching to this larger question about, as you mentioned, a very important issue of diversification. And also, and my thoughts having to do with exhibitions like the Soul of a Nation and also the Carrie James Marshall exhibition.
You wrote a catalog essay, I believe.
I wrote an essay in the Fiden book. But I mean, the thing about this is that Soul of a Nation, Carrie James Marshall. I mean, I missed the opening, but understood from all my friends that every person of color flew in from all over the world. They even came from Mars to come to this exhibition, and so. It was so many black people more black people in an institution at one time. And the Carrie James Marshall showed us the same. Now, my complaint is that these are very rare situations. That the reality is that not so much the art work, the market, because the market is sort of has. Sort of learned this lesson. I mean, when I showed in New York in the 70s, I was, only maybe 20 black artists who'd had the chance to have an exhibition. And of the galleries I was showing in, I was the only black artist. I was in Leo Castelli and John Weber Gallery. And they've never shown a black artist in those galleries. And some of the artists in the showers were protesting even the Whitney, about not including the work of black artists and so forth. And so right now, if you look at the market, there's a lot more artists of color. Not enough women, and not enough artists of color, but there's a lot more than there used to be, right? But the museums haven't caught up with that yet. I mean, one of the problems that I've encountered, or I should say that I've been asked and dealt with, as I said, that I've been serving on boards and so forth, is how do you diversify our attendance? How do we bring more people of color to see the exhibitions? And my answer's always been the same. As soon as you show something they would be interested in seeing, then it would become diversified. But the problem remained. There's a big struggle to do that. That if you have there's a conflict. There's still a conflict in terms of what is the best art being shown, and how do you diversify an audience. Because the issue is that there's a lot of catching up to do, because museums in their collection, even their strategies of acquisition, are modeled after the old sort of model of sort of best practices. That is coming from the Eurocentric art history. But then at the same time, they recognize that as they follow through on this model, they're not getting enough diversity, and they want the diversity too. It's not like they're doing this intentionally. It's like they could figure it out. And then when you say, well, and this, it's
Well, like what Neil just said, like not showing the Rothko, or maybe showing the Rothko with the lesser.
Aside from that, I mean, the point is that there isn't a way of diversification using that old model. This is not possible. If we have Naima Keith, who was the director of this African American Museum here in LA, within a month, I've never seen anything like it. It became a center for a diverse population, not only people of color, but I even saw some people drive from Beverly Hills down to.
Even. Oh my God.
Yeah, it was amazing. But what she was showing is she's showing the kinds of exhibitions that didn't come out of that old model, and so I think still, that when we have these wonderful exhibitions like Soul of a Nation and or featuring Kerry James, when you have these things, they have to be more regular. They have to be more constant in the exhibition.
Not just a one-off.
And also they have to be intentional, because it doesn't happen simply by
intentionality. Which, Joanne.
Yeah.
Well, things are changing. Okay. By the way, the issue is not just unfairness to people of color. Women have been discriminated in the art world for years, in history. Okay.
Yeah.
The value of great women artists has never compared to the value of great male artists.
Well, who was it? I don't want to misquote, but I believe it was Baselitz who said that women can't paint. Was it?
Baselitz said that.
Yeah, Baselitz said that.
I
that women
don't know
can't
who
paint.
said it, but he was a fool. But that is changing in the last several years, and I'm now talking about the market price for art, okay? Which you could say is maybe irrelevant to this conversation, but it's not irrelevant to the artists, certainly. But the value of the great women artists have been appreciating very significantly over the last several years, and the same is true of people of color. Okay, you mentioned Marshall. I mean, some of his works have been going for humongous prices. So in that sense, there's been a change, and the museums are also changing. The Whitney, we've raised a lot of money to get this Hammond's piece that's going to be that he is creating. That's going to be
the outdoor.
it's going to be in the water, in the Hudson River, right across of the Whitney. It's going to be a fantastic piece. So this is all changing. But I would like to just indicate, I'm a great lover of art, and I believe that art is really helping humanity, making the world a better place. But there are something that's bothering me right now that I have to express. There are some groups, I think they're totally unfair and improper, who are attacking cultural institutions, museums in particular, for people who are on their board with a totally ridiculous attack in many cases. We at the Whitney have a trustee who's been attacked because he owns a company that makes tear gas. And that they've alleged that his tear gas was used on the Mexican border. Number one, I don't know whether it was used or not, but even if it was, he certainly didn't decide who should use, where the tear gas should be used. That was a decision made by the federal government. And don't misunderstand me, I'm not in favor of what they did. I am criticizing the attack of a trustee because he owns a company that makes tear gas. Now, I might also add, okay, that if we didn't make tear gas, okay, then what would the government be doing when there were riots? Would they be shooting and killing the people instead of using tear gas? I was thinking of what happened years ago when there was the great protest, I think it was at Penn State, of all the students, and they ended up shooting a bunch of students. So I think making tear gas is a good thing to do because it gives the government something to, rather than killing people or whipping them or beating them with sticks or something, or clubs. But in any event, the bottom line of it is I think that these people have gone to extreme to attack cultural institutions and their trustees unjustifiably, and I don't think that that's a good thing.
So I am very involved with the Tate, and I remember Jeremy Deller, the kind of incredible artist of British origin, represented Great Britain at the Venice Biennial, and sat on the board of trustees at Tate, which, as Charles, as you know, as an artist, to be involved in a cultural institution, you have to be very thoughtful. And Tate is a government institution, and the board is government appointed. And Jeremy, discussed often the protests of BP's support of the Tate and of cultural institutions in England, BP, the large oil company. And he said, and again, not trying to misquote, so everyone please look it up, but along the lines of, it's so much sexier for people to protest on the steps of the Tate and to protest BP's support of the Tate rather than going and protesting BP directly. And in a way, it's, this deflection of protest to, protest the cultural institution rather than protesting, the company or the person. And I think that, Charles, we were also discussing, the work you've done in Boyle Heights and, these groups that you felt, you were trying to be involved in the creation of a cultural institution. And, there was severe, comments about gentrification. And I'm sure, Joanne, you've also had to deal with this in terms of the ideas of gentrification and, protest of a changing landscape of a city.
Yeah, so I'm burning to respond to that.
Yes, great.
Because I was actually, the group that you're talking about, I was also a victim of, in the sense that in the Boyle Heights controversy, where I was accused of being responsible for the deportation of 4 families out of Boyle Heights, simply because a group I was in held a meeting at the painter's name.
The lady.
What's that painter?
Boyle Heights.
Laura Owens.
Laura
Owens, yeah.
Right.
We had a political meeting at Laura Owens' studio, and they're trying to get.
Laura Owens, showed it.
Yeah, and Laura was also the center of controversy. Her show was the center of controversy at the Whitney. But there's a phenomenon going on where there are organizations. They're not art organizations. They're organizations who whose political orientation is to defend helpless people, and museums have gotten caught up and I agree that part of the reason that they get caught up is because they're an easy target. in protests and so forth of these organizations. But the point I want to make is that these organizations really care very little about art. What they're interested in is targets to be able to point to as instances of institutional oppression of people who don't have power. And it's because it's because I see that, at least it's been my experience too, that although artists are very much involved in the progressive politics, the similar kind of progressive politics that these organizations have, they're not really involved in the strategies. You find that they don't agree with some of the tactics that were used against the Whitney, where there isn't a room for communication, right? So it's very careful. It's very important to see that the museum is simply one of the institutions that are subject to this kind of critique. It's not the only one. And for the most part, it's just like the Boyle Heights issue and the Whitney issue. It's a conversation with Adam Weinberg that I think of myself as a progressive, but I know that I could not support such an idea because essentially an American economy is so complicated that you'd have to be very specific about what are the terms and conditions by which certain people should not be board members. Otherwise, you lose almost all your board members, right? So.
Yep.
Well, I'm just listening with fascination, and maybe I'm in the wrong room, but it strikes me that in this era of ridiculous political correctness, if you attack the institutional people capable of steering these cultural institutions for their perceived lack of diversity or alignment with your political agenda, but you want the institutions to support a show like Soul of America or the show with all the lynching, which has thought-provoking and disturbing imagery, then you're trying to cleanse the board of the kind of people that have the courage to present that thought-challenging art.
I think that's an interesting point. Well, I would only just, there are a million dots that are hanging out there that I could pick up right now, right? But just to touch on a couple of them. One thing just that slightly responds to that gentleman's comment is just having, connected to so many cultural organizations all across the board, I will tell you, and having connected with them specifically on the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, one thing we hear repeatedly by organizations and leadership are actually challenges in terms of board leadership as relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion in many ways. Both the real challenge of organizations trying to raise resources and doing that in a traditional way that may look at the ability to give large sums of money and how that might overlap with an effort to diversify their board in terms of are they thinking about various kinds of resources, intellectual resources, representation of the communities that they serve, but also how they're working with their board and whether there's alignment on the kinds of change that organization may be trying to lead and whether those board members are really on board. So I actually hear a lot that there's a lot of kind of thinking and conversation, but also still, from what I hear often from organizations, a bit of a challenge and a divide on that piece in terms of how that moves forward. But I would also just offer, in terms of thinking about this last round of the conversation, that it seems to me ultimately this is in large part what the conference is about, right? A lot of the genesis, in my view, of all of the activism or the protest or concerns around gentrification are about the notion of shared prosperity. Right? And so how do we get it when we haven't fully seen it in the country, right? And so cultural organizations as public institutions may end up being subject to activism or thoughtful conversations that they may internally want to have. It reminds me a few years ago about when universities started having much more public conversations, or their own students started talking about whether they should divest certain of their endowment holdings. It strikes me as very similar in terms of folks wanting to say, we want to lift up a conversation about what is our role and who are we, working together with, and what is our leadership about. And I think that whether
being
you
able to
agree with
have
the
the
tactics or
conversation.
not, I think it's an interesting conversation around that piece. That was the only thing.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because I heard the word political correct.
Oh, political.
Huh?
Political correctness.
Yeah, political correctness, so I just wanted to be careful of that kind of word, because with respect to that, even considering the position I have about these issues politically, I would be defined as a person interested in political correctness, and I don't think of myself that way. What I think of myself as being interested in certain issues that are tied to people of my environment, of my background, of my experiences. Bringing, as you say, the diversification of power, which is the reason why these protests are happening in the first place, because there isn't this a sort of a space where people feel that they have equal access to power. And I think it's a responsibility of all these institutions to try to diversify and try to bring into play a way of equal power distribution. I think that, as you said, that things have changed. There's a lot more artists making a lot more money who are people of color. Women artists are still making less than men artists, but they're getting a lot more attention. But the museums are not diversified. They're not. All you have to do is go to the shows. And to say that, well, what would be success in the realm of diversification? Success is if you would have a diverse, a regular population of people who are diverse. That would be success. Now, I admit that this is going to take a long time to get there. But that's the model. And the reason why you don't have that is because whatever is the marker of presence, identity, and power that people who are not attending the museums, whatever those markers are, they're not at the museum.
So
And
Joanne was
yeah.
talking about intentionality on our talk, and you said one. Please share again. It was about if you're looking at the future of success, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, well, we live in LA. This is an incredibly diverse city. And I guess, so I don't really, it's sort of an inevitability that it's, I don't mean to sound, this is going to sound maybe a little trite, but it's sort of silly to fight it in a way. I know it's not that easy. I'm not, but, I think what I strive for myself and what I would advise people to do as much as possible is open their channels, right? And that sounds very abstract maybe, but you kind of have to, I have a lot of colleagues in the art world and the museum world. Perhaps I might be slightly speaking a little bit more about my white colleagues who are so concerned about getting it right before they even get it. Getting it right before. And I kind of, so I think taking chances, that means taking chances, that means being vulnerable to changing your institution. That means, taking some risks. That means just being open. I don't know how else to put it. And that's sort of the ethos of the museum. And we, at the Broad, in terms of our audience is about 65% non-white. And very young. And those things in LA, by the way, I think tend to go hand in hand. If you have a young audience, you're going to get a diverse audience, or else you're really doing something wrong, I think, personally. I think that's true in business. I mean, how are you going to survive as a business if you're not dealing with inclusion, diversity, and equity, all of these things?
Right.
You're not going to succeed.
Yeah.
It just isn't going to work. Ultimately, it might work for a while. It's still not much longer. So that's just my opinion.
I would wholeheartedly agree, and I would also just, for those either in the room or watching live stream who aren't as familiar with LA and LA County, so the nation, across the nation, if you're just looking at race and ethnicity, not even thinking about LGBT, people with disabilities, gender, right? But even just looking at race and ethnicity, the United States is projecting being majority minority around 2040. LA County has been majority minority since the 80s, right? So the future is now, and in fact, we're tipping into a majority that is Latinx specifically. And of course, younger generations continue to be more diverse, more mixed. I feel like ask any young person, they're like, yeah, of course, my friend is, right, she's queer, he's mixed, da 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 da, like what? And so we definitely see that as a thread in conversation, whether it's the arts or business or government, that diversity is really one of our greatest assets, and that to really move forward and continue to be successful, that's absolutely part and parcel of what we need to be looking at.
And I think, in terms of activists and protests, it's hard. It's really hard. And it's not necessarily, neither side is getting it right all the time, but I think dialogue is what I try, it's not always possible, but what I try to go to.
Yeah.
I opened the museum on a day with, Eli's very active with education reform, and there was, a few thousand people protesting the moment that I opened the museum in 2015. And, you have to I just let it, just let it happen.
Of course. And I guess.
I'm not saying that's the answer always, but in our case, that was the answer, and it was fine.
Mm-hmm. And look where we are now.
Yeah.
Do we have a question?
Some advice from the art world. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So I work with women who are coming home from prisons. And there's this one woman who came home recently after almost 3 decades. And she was the master artist inside of the prison. So I don't know how to connect her. I did take her to Michael's. I was having a bad day at work. I said, let me do something I really like. And I took her to Michael's, and I brought her canvas and paint and what is the thing? The easel and all of the brushes and stuff. But I would like advice from all or either of you around how do I support her and connect her in a way to the art world.
Well, I'm sure the county, you have some really interesting county programs that, really most institutions actually have kind of incredible things, but maybe Kristen, you can talk about a little,
Sure.
One of the projects you do.
Sure, I can speak a bit to my piece, and then others can chime in. So, absolutely, through the grants that we give within the grantee pool, we have many organizations that might actually be a really great opportunity to connect in terms of opportunities for art making, supporting artists, really, and also bridging specifically with our justice and systems involved communities. In our work specifically, our work to date has really involved arts education for youth in terms of juvenile justice. And I have to say, I know this wonderful woman's work through the National Art for Justice initiative, of which we're both a part this year. But I would say absolutely, I am happy to speak in terms of having our team look at what organizations are available that actually might provide direct programs that could really be of service. But I also think there's a broader set of kind of infrastructure that is so important that it's in place, whether that's libraries, parks, cultural institutions, where people can go, where there's a safe space for art making, for art appreciation. And so I think obviously it's not just in our role, but I'm sure we can also identify some specific organizations.
I think, the Whitney has been really a leader in New York, I think, in terms of a lot of their public education programs.
Oh, yeah.
And in terms of, what they do. I think, most institutions will offer, through their work with communities, like family days or, education days. And so I think, we can speak maybe a little bit more after, but I think that's an important part of it.
I would None of us up here, I don't think, are directly representing the gallery
No.
field, but that's also another, opportunity. If this person is an artist themselves, right, is connecting them to the galleries that might be around, that might also be interested.
Just how to support her in a way that supports her
Yeah.
to go on and be creative.
Well, Charles, how did you?
And how that community, I know we all have communities, and how that community.
Well, I think it's actually a really good question, and really not very much about this panel, but I do think people ask often, I mean, how did you become an artist? And how did you become a successful artist?
There wasn't, I don't know. I don't know, because it wasn't like I sat down one day and said, well, should I be an artist or not? It was, in my case, it was the environment sort of identified me as an artist or budding artist, even when I was in elementary school and I went to an art high school. So the path was there. But there's this other thing, though, of course, is how do you survive as an artist? And that's equally a mystery for me, how that happens. But with respect to your question, one way or another, your friend really needs an artist mentor of some sort, and there are arts organizations that are community centered that would be an idea, and I'm sure you might be able to be helpful in terms of directing. That's an ideal place where you can go with your friend and talk to them. A community-centered arts organization, which would have a natural inclination to do this, and through that process, a person, a kind of mentor, relationship could be established. I think that's pretty much important because even if you just think of anybody in the world who wants to be an artist, it's a terrifying set of possibilities. It's only made sort of sustainable and understandable if you're in a community. But out by itself, it's absolutely terrifying. You don't know what to do. Yeah.
Drawings are exquisite. They are just absolutely exquisite. And I just think that I don't know how to.
It's a work.
Thank you for that mentor.
But I would just say one thing. There'd be less discrimination, okay, and an easier path for an artist who served time as opposed to getting a job in industry and things of that nature, because of the very nature of art and the institutions, the Whitney, we're progressive, okay? So I'm sure that if your friend is a good artist, there would be no discrimination against him or her because that person was once in jail. In fact, it could be a plus.
Trey?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you guys so much. This has been a really fascinating conversation. When you talk about inclusion and social change, what you're really talking about is kind of a values shift. Like, how do we shift the values of institutions, of funders, of people who are artists, of people who fund art? We're at the Milken conference, and so I have to mention that so much of the art world is driven by economics. And, like, who has the money? Who has the ability to be a patron? Who can start their own museum? Who can start a program for internships? And I think that that's where the really difficult conversation is. I mean, you look at the Kochs and the Sacklers and people who have been glad to use art to kind of wash away kind of the sins of their earnings, but yet we need those earnings in order to kind of actually supply credible programs in the way. So I don't know who's prepared to answer this, but kind of how do you approach this new conversation about matching up your economic realities with, demanding certain values be frontmost?
Actually, so Joanne, you have not had to deal with those types of questions because your board does not have, so perhaps you are the
because we're not fundraising?
Yes, yes.
Well, I do fundraise, it's just I've got one prospect.
So what would you do if you had to be that?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think about that a lot because I think in a way, because of the nature of the institution that I'm running, I actually have more freedom, which is sort of paradoxical, right? I sometimes find it paradoxical. I get in trouble when I say this, so I have to pause, but to be referred to as a private museum, because we actually serve in it. We had 815,000 visitors to the museum last year. We're on track for a higher number this year. I spend most of my time thinking about our audience, and our audience is mostly non-white. And I think about artists, obviously, and so I'm spending, as the leader of the institution, I'm spending all my time, most of my time, on content. So there's an enormous amount of freedom. I don't think that's exactly the answer to your question.
But so maybe Neil, can we put you on the spot? We have just one last chance because I believe we're ending. But
I also would like to say something.
oh, okay.
Like,
So I'm sure you've thought about so much of what's happening related to the Sackler family and their donations to the arts. So for example, the Tate has taken the stance of they will not be accepting any further donations from the Sacklers, but they do have a donation in place from the Sacklers. So that is not being returned. So what? Yeah. So it's an interesting stance to take.
Like going forward.
Yeah.
So what
So
is?
what? So example at the Whitney. What do you kind of have a policy on? Donations moving forward. For example, the Sacklers have been obviously a huge source of controversy in the last 6 months or a year.
Right. Well, to my knowledge, they have not been supportive of the Whitney, so that isn't something we've had to deal with. But to my knowledge, we don't have. First, I don't know exactly what the Sacklers did or didn't do, but from what I'm reading, it certainly sounds like they did horrible things. But
It's the Purdue thing. Right?
what?
The Purdue,
The
yeah.
Purdue thing.
Yeah. But be that as it may, I just brought out what the attacks on a couple of our trustees. One was an attack on people who were major shareholders of General Dynamics, who makes airplanes and fighter planes. You want America not to be able to defend itself? I mean, that's ridiculous, okay? This wouldn't be the great country we are if we didn't have a strong military. This thing has gone too far. But if you have call it bad people, if you will, who have, as capitalists, done wrong things, then I think the museum has to ask itself whether they want to take a donation from that person or not. And I'm sure the Whitney, which is a very liberal organization, would decide not to take it. And I want you to know that one of the major things that our Board of Trustees deals with at the Whitney is to increase more minorities on the board. All of the things you've been talking about are issues that we deal with and are trying to get better at.
And so I think on that, it's the idea of intentionality. And so I will say thank you to our audience members and, go forward with purpose.
I have an
and
answer for
Kristen has an answer on that. But really, I think it's like being very aware of, the people that we interact with, the institutions that we attend, the shows that we see, and, the boards and artists that we interact with. So thank you very much.